my coaching community. Very exciting indeed. Also, thank you to Deakin School of Exercise and Nutrition Sciences for supporting connecting PhD students and their research with end users. And so in this case, that's you, the coach. I'd like to make special mention to my PhD supervisors, Associate Professor Dan Dwyer, Associate Professor Lindell Bruce, Dr. Samantha Hoffman, and Dr. Peter Creamer. So we'll get going. We're talking about training load processes and training management-based communication, although that is more communication that sits outside of that. I'm a sports scientist, a coach, not training very much at the moment, but I'm an age group triathlete as well. So first up, we're talking about the training load process, and I want you to keep this in mind as we make our way through the slide deck and talk about the various facets of the training load process. We have prescription of load, measurement of load, monitoring of load, and then managing of load. And so that's a cyclical process. We start with prescription, looking at objective data and subjective data. And so best practice in the literature tells us that when we're prescribing a workout, that we can use a combination of metrics to provide the athlete with some guidelines. Basically, we're talking about objective data like distance, duration, pace, and power, and subjective data like rate of perceived exertion. We then measure some things based on those metrics, and that includes not just the sport load itself, but we should also be taking into account life load. And so the life load or the non-sport load component adds an additional layer of stress that we should be factoring in when we're measuring or quantifying load based on what we've prescribed. We then go to monitoring load, and what that means is that we're looking at what has been planned for the athlete versus what they've completed. And so it's not just how much distance and duration have they completed, there's also an intensity component. If we've prescribed a workout based on RPE, have they hit those RPE values or power values? If so, great. If not, why not? And some additional digging, which is where that communication piece comes in, may be required. And then we come to managing load, factoring in their recent training, perhaps that session, perhaps a week or a month, some niggles that they may have had that brought a non-sport picture, so that we can go ahead and adjust load, prescribe the next block, the next week, the next period of training based on the information, objective and subjective information that we've gathered. I now want to draw your attention to another concept that was presented in a 2020 presentation in Oxford in the UK by Stephen Seiler. And this is a great way to orient both the athlete and also yourself to see how this relationship of external work or external load having an internal cost. So external load in terms of pace and power has an internal cost both in terms of objective, heart rate and lactate as examples, and internal subjective costs, which is how the athlete feels they're going at that point in time during a workout or rate of perceived exertion. By drawing connections with those things and encouraging the athlete to look at that as kind of an instrument panel on a, if you will, like a plane, the airline pilot's looking at altitude, they're looking at the RPM of the engines, wind speed, airspeed, all of those different things. If you think about it in that way, you're not just looking at one instrument gauge. We're looking at all of the gauges and their relationship with one another. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through it. That cost of that training carries with it some load responses. And so this is where we look at things like resting heart rate as a way to gauge fatigue or the impact of training with the athlete. We can also look at things like heart rate variability, and to a lesser extent, we can look at things like biomarkers like creatine kinase levels, although that tends not to be the case too much with age group athletes. Moving on to the next slide, I want to introduce you or reinforce in some ways that concept of tracking those metrics throughout that entire training load process. And so when we prescribe something based on RPE, it can send confusing messages we see in the literature to the athlete when it gets to the end of that process where we're having a discussion with them, where all of a sudden we're talking about objective data, but we're not drawing that connection with, well, here was what was prescribed using RPE, and now we're not talking about that anymore. And so the idea with that load process is as we go around that cycle that we're tracking all of the metrics that were prescribed and correlating that back between objective and subjective data so that when we have that discussion with the athlete, how did that interval go? How did you feel about that? The light bulb moment is, aha, I was prescribed that, and now we're having a discussion about that, and there's that consistency in that process. What we've seen in our research is that our biases as coaches, our backgrounds as coaches with our work history, conversations that we've had, certifications that we've done, carry with them that experience and those conversations with other coaches or whatever the case may be, carries with it some biases, positive and potentially negative biases. And so in terms of that positive component, when we spoke to coaches, an example is a coach who was used to working overnight shifts in their work history. And so they were really well informed when it came to the ER doctor or the nurse or whatever the case may be, as to how to coach those athletes who had to deal with those working hours and the impact that that had on their circadian rhythm. So they were really well informed. And so the opportunity there for you is to take advantage of your strengths in terms of what you can identify that might be happening with the pattern of an athlete's training. The other thing to say too, which we also saw as an example, was a coach who'd been a professional athlete quite some time ago, and they had a preference for prescribing training based largely on RPE and heart rate, which is all fine. But what we can see going back to that triangulation concept is that they tend not to look so much at that external cost. So the external work has an internal cost, and they were kind of not looking at that external picture so much. And so they're kind of potentially missing a key element to looking at that instrument gauge and teaching the athlete, well, when you're working at this RPE or this heart rate, this might be normal for you at the moment in terms of that pace or power. So the takeaway for you is that when you're reflecting on your practice, think about any biases that you have towards metrics, towards particular types of technology, and try to remain open as to the advantages of some of those pieces of metrics. As well, just say Jesse just had a note there to say we'll be doing a Q&A at the end too, which we will be. So keep that in mind when you're prescribing and measuring load. Engagement with an athlete's non-sporting life was another key piece of another key finding that came through with the research. And so there's layers of stress with an athlete's training. We have that baseline metabolic stress that we have just for everyday function without doing anything other than keeping upright. And so that has a physiological cost to it. Then we have all of our non-sporting stresses, family, work, study, hobbies, social life, all of those things have a cost to them. Whatever's left over is what we can allocate to training. And so if you think about those pieces of the puzzle, if we don't know what's going on with the non-sporting stresses, it makes it very hard to go forward and prescribe load, not having a full picture. We don't have to know all of the ins and outs of what's going on in an athlete's life, but in that communication component, I would encourage you to engage with the athlete to get a sense of, hey, how's everything else going at the moment? Are you finding that training in the context of everything else that you've got going on is going okay for you at the moment? Or maybe something more specific. You mentioned you had a deadline last week. Have you got that big project out of the way and now we can have a bigger week with training if that suits you at the moment? That's a great way to prescribe load in an informed way so that you're not overstressing the athlete. And I'll talk a little bit about that more shortly. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the ins and outs of the training stress balance chart that we see in Training Peaks. And Jesse, can I just confirm with you that those three boxes have come up, the acute, chronic, and training stress balance?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, so when we're looking at acute load in terms of like a 7-day time frame or a chronic load, a longer time frame over a period of say 6 weeks, And then we look at training stress balance, which is the difference between those two. It gives us a sense of if the athlete's in negative territory, if they're under pressure with their training and they've done a lot of load recently, or if they're somewhat recovered. The thing to keep in mind is what I said previously in relation to those layers of load, the metabolic stress or that homeostasis that it just keeps us functioning, non-sport stress, sport stress. All of those things are captured under here. What we see is the sport load, but what is sitting underneath that is what's going on in the athlete's life. So if the athlete's not adapting, or you're not seeing in this picture and other parts of Training Peaks or whatever training management system that you're using, if you're not seeing what you're expecting in terms of adaptations, or perhaps the graph's not looking quite right, maybe it's because there's something else going on behind the scenes. So bear that in mind when you're looking at reports, that it's not just about the training data, it's also about other things as well. So now we're talking about communication, which is a critical component we see in our research and also other people's research when it comes to fundamentals of developing a good relationship with the athlete. On the back of that is building trust, building a rapport with the athlete so that they're happy to open up about what's going on with training, perhaps some detail about what's going on in their life, so you know that if they're under some life stress, that perhaps they're not going to be able to cope with training so well. And a key component, of course, is regular communication with that. We can see with the research that if that relationship is healthy and communication is frequent, that we can elicit more information out of the athlete to inform us when it comes to that training load process of prescription, measurement, monitoring and management. It adds an additional layer of information. We also see in the research that by commenting on workouts in that training management system, the athlete recognises that they're not just uploading data, going to the effort of measuring things with their watch or bicycle head unit and uploading data, and is the coach actually looking at this data? If the coach is commenting on the data and contextualising that training, either within just that session or perhaps contextualising it in the broader picture of a training program, the athlete is more engaged. The coach is looking at my training, and that's encouraging. And I know I'm more inclined not only to upload training, to provide a rating of perceived exertion, to provide a comment, and that really encourages that communication cycle. What we've seen, I don't know if it's surprising or not, it's maybe a little bit concerning, is that often with training management systems, the coaches that we've looked at, some of the training data we've looked at, is that communication can be quite infrequent. And so that process of building trust and commenting on sessions doesn't seem to be happening. A lot of that communication, though, granted, could be happening outside of training management systems. And we know instant messenger and phone and text message and face-to-face communication, of course, as well, sometimes video calls, all of that supplements training management communication. So it's not the be-all and end-all. But contextualising workouts is an important component of training management system usage. We move on to the key concept here, that engagement needs to be meaningful and regular, and there's lots of different strategies that you can use to engage with the athlete. It's not necessarily just about commenting in the training management system about the workout. You might be commenting on something more broadly. It might be a skill-based goal that they had for that week or that block. It might be something outside. How's your knee going? You mentioned that you had a bit of a niggle. How's that going? Or if you finished that work project that you had, or whatever the case may be, it shows that you're engaged with the athlete more broadly beyond just the training. So I want to move on now to an example, and this is an athlete I coach in the US. I'm stressing this is not the absolute gold standard of feedback to athletes by any stretch of the imagination, but it gives you an idea of that process of using subjective and objective information to engage with the athlete. So this is someone that's new to Ironman. They're doing their first Ironman. It's just a long, easy run, nothing too complicated. And I've set them some targets with heart rate, I encourage all of my athletes to use a mood rating to give me a sense of how they feel. In this case, the athletes said that they felt strong after that workout. They've rated the rating of perceived exertion as a 3, and so that makes sense that it's meant to be an easy long run. They've given it an RPE of 3. I'm starting to look at the picture going, okay, this is fine. They've made a comment, legs are a bit stiff. Stiff, did some stretching afterwards. Great. So my response to that is great aerobic capacity building, good work on the stretching. So I've acknowledged that they've done the run as they as it was planned, and also recognise that they've added an additional thing which I didn't request. So good job on the stretching. As I said, it's not the be all and end all of coach comments, but it just gives you an idea of how that process is implemented. So I just want to reinforce that alignment, that discussion about aligning training load, which we see actually worked with the coaches that we interviewed that they did this quite well. And we've all heard the athlete that's come to us with a big goal. I want to qualify for the Ironman World Championships or a half Ironman World Championships, or I want to do a 100K trail run or something like that. Very big goal. But their non-sport commitments might not allow for that. Their family commitments, work, social life, hobbies, whatever the case may be, they're time crunched. They may not have the support structures in place. A lot of demands from family or friends, or a partner which is super busy, and so they have to look after the kids, or whatever the case may be. The discussion with athletes, again, this comes back to the subjective data and building that rapport with the athlete, is about is there alignment with these things? The goals that you have for training, the goals that you have for racing, do they line up with the picture of everything that's going on in your life? And so again, we come back to this notion of those 3 layers of stress: baseline metabolic stress, non-sporting stress, sport stress. And if that equals more than 100%, I use that inverted commas, if it's beyond the athlete's capacity for an extended period of time, it can start to present problems. And so this fatigue spectrum here, we have down the one end, we have recovered, where the athlete's essentially detraining, through to functional overreaching, where they may be stretching a little bit towards the top end of their capacity. And you see that with heavy training blocks or things like training camps. Then we go into non-functional overreaching, where we get maladaptive responses, where the adaptations that we're seeking through structured training start to break down because the athlete's doing too much that's beyond their capacity. And remember, not just based on sporting stress. This is potentially other things that are going on. Maybe they're not 100% well and they're busy with work, and then on top of that, they're trying to do a lot of training. So we need to be always looking at that complete picture of training load. I want to talk a little bit more about subjective data and just reinforce the importance of it. A 2016 paper by Anna Saw et al. Was a big review of the literature on subjective data. And what that paper basically said is that both over acute short timeframes and chronic longer timeframes, subjective data can actually be more sensitive than objective data. Bear that in mind. Subjective data can be actually more sensitive than objective data, especially when it comes to fatigue status. And so it's important to engage with the athlete and determine how they're feeling about how they're going. Not just, oh, well, that was a great workout today. It looks like you hit all of those numbers with the intervals that we had planned. That may be all well and good, but in the conversation with the athlete, it may turn out that they managed to get there, but they're starting to feel a bit cooked. And so bear that in mind, that when you're assessing load, that you're engaging in conversation with the athlete about how they're feeling, RPE, mood scores, using that example that I showed, depending on what training management system you're using, and getting a comment. Doesn't have to be necessarily a detailed comment, a few words, a sentence, just to provide an ongoing feedback loop so that you can get a sense of things. So this is the part that Jesse alluded to. This is unpublished data. It relates to what we've talked about in terms of training load and communication. And I want to set the scene by saying that we looked at, and so this is with the journal at the moment. I'm hoping that it gets accepted soon. We'll wait and see. And it's also potentially something that I'll be presenting at a conference, an international conference later this year. We looked at 95 triathletes from around the world. We got 6 months of data, something like 35,000 training sessions to determine what does we think, at least based on this group, and they were across a broad range of ages and a broad range of load, as you can see here. And we're looking at percentiles. So if we think about that bell curve, the middle percentile is the middle value, which is similar to the average. So the 50th percentile is kind of that middle value. And at the thin parts of that bell curve, we have the 5th percentile, and up the other end, the 95th percentile. Now, Jesse's recording this, so I'm not going to read out all of these, but just for interest, we'll go through duration and distance for that middle value. We can see here, I can actually seeing it on the small screen there, so I'm going to bring it up on my screen as well too. Jesse, can you still see that slide? I don't want to have gone off that slide.
We can, yes.
Excellent. So we can see there the 50th percentile is about, and remember, this is the average training week over 6 months. So, of course, they deviate up and down. People in these different percentiles, they might have a heavy block where they're doing more than this, and a recovery period or an off-season where they're doing less than this. So this is an average week. And on average, the 50th percentile are doing about 1.4 hours of swimming, 4.4 hours of cycling, and about 2.5 hours of running a week. And that equates to 4.1 kilometers of swimming, about 108 or up to nearly 110 kilometers of cycling, and 25.5 Ks of running. We can see up at the 95th percentile, it goes much higher than that. And remember, this is sustained average training over 6 months. So on average, 10 Ks of swimming, 295 Ks of cycling, and 60 Ks of running. And so they could be going much higher than that as well too during the lead into a big race. So you'll be able to go back to this data. The other thing I want to say too is that when this study does get published, we're also releasing a web app where you can go in and put your own training load or your athlete's training load and compare this to what we think is a representative sample of athletes from around the world. So it constitutes what might be typical of age group athletes. Second to last slide, I want to draw your attention to some tools based on papers from Stephen Seiler, Carl Foster, and Gunnar Borg, all of whom are well known in the endurance sport space in academia. We talk about traditionally in academic papers of 3 training zones that largely relate to energy systems or energy metabolism. Zone 1, which is fat oxidation or fat metabolism when we're quote unquote burning fat. Zone 2, which relates to glycolysis or burning glycogen, our body's way of storing complex carbohydrates, which then break down into more simple sugars. And then our third zone, where the line between zone 2 and zone 3 is traditionally what's known as threshold training. And above that threshold, our body is starting to generate more lactate, not lactic acid, generating more lactate than we can clear. The lactic acid part is when a hydrogen ion is released, and the hydrogen ion is a thing that does damage. And then the lactate our body can actually use as a fuel source, although not for extended periods once we start to get above that curve exponentially. We can see here a 5-zone model, and so we can start to relate now for the athlete when we're triangulating them, teaching them about that relationship between objective and subjective data. We can see how those things relate to intensity zones. Here we've got a 5-zone model. Typically, the additional zones relate to areas around those demarcations between the different energy metabolisms. So when you're right on the cusp of going from one zone to another, that's where those additional zones come from. When we talk about 7-zone, 8-zone models, we tend to talk about additional zones for nuance in terms of intensity above into that lactate zone. So that's what we're talking about there. And there's some relationships with lactate as well. Importantly, we look at the scale, a modified RPE scale on the right, 0 being rest and 10 being maximal all out. We can teach the athlete about how those RPE scales, typical with the typical athlete, how that relates to RPE, how that relates to zones. So we can say loosely, when you're up to about 4 out of 10, you're probably still mainly around fat oxidation. When you're somewhere between 6 and up to 7, sometimes even 7.5, still mainly, and these aren't hard lines, remember, we have relative contributions from these energy systems throughout. It's easy to draw up a diagram like this and think, oh, I'm switching from one to the other. No, there's relative contributions from these energy systems. When we go up to a 7 and 7.5, we're now starting to get a lot of lactate in the system. And so we can see that RPE, as that Anna Saw paper says, can provide us with an indication, a quite good indication of the hard energy system contribution. All right, so the last wrap-up slide, and then we can take some questions. I'm just wanting to go to the next slide. We've talked about training load and using objective and subjective data throughout that training load process and why it's important to communicate those things to the athlete in terms of triangulation, so we can have those conversations with the athlete and so they can start to get a sense of how those things relate to one another, and you'll get used to how those things relate to one another for each of your athletes. Data accuracy, we briefly mentioned that it's important in order to get accurate load that we need to be calibrating devices, and that's typically based on field testing. We might get athletes to do time trials or an FTP test or whatever the case is. We enter that data into our devices and our training management platforms so that we get an accurate reflection of sport load. And then on top of that, we have triangulation, which we've talked about quite a bit, monitoring and managing load over acute and chronic timeframes as well, bearing in mind that there's non-sport stresses in that as well, and the all-important subjective data and how accurate that can be in relation to objective data. So certainly don't discount that as part of your load picture. That's it from me. I think that's pretty much bang on 30 minutes, Jesse, which is about what we said. I'd like to thank you very much. And of course, there have been a few pictures of me through this presentation. I want to say that the reason that is it means I don't have to go and seek copyright approval from someone else. So I hope you don't mind that I've squeezed in a few triathlon-related pictures of myself in there as well. If you'd like to contact me, there's some contact details there. I believe that they'll come up on the recording as well. And now I'll hand it back to Jesse to facilitate some questioning.
Thanks, Leighton. So we've got two ways. We've got a few ways that we can post some questions. So we can either do it via unmuting yourself with a microphone, even raising your hand, or you can put it in the chat or the Q&A. We've got one here already from Liz, which I'll read out, which is, when do you recommend adjusting the training plan based on subjective data inputs, especially if the objective data is still trending well?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think these things come back to patterns. And so there is some evidence to suggest that if these data trends become a recognizable pattern, whether that's objective data or subjective data, that there might be some misalignment somewhere, and perhaps some investigation is that an athlete may be able to stretch themselves for a period of time. The potential risk is not always being able to see when they're going to, I'm looking for a better expression, going to fall off the cliff, essentially, is that they can say, for example, they can sustain that for a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month, or whatever the case is. But if you're seeing a trend where they keep saying, I'm really feeling cooked, I can hit the numbers, I'm struggling, that maybe it's time to give them a recovery day, a recovery week even. If they're heading into overtraining territory, that can be a case of having easy weeks, sometimes even easy months to get an athlete back to baseline. So I would say it's contextual. It depends on what you know about the athlete, their training history, how you've dealt with them in the past, and perhaps if you have a sense in terms of their capacity. So it's a bit of a classic sports science answer is it depends.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we know that one workout doesn't make you fit. One workout doesn't build an athlete. You build an athlete through building a body of cumulative fitness, and building that resilience and resistance to fatigue over time. And so when does you referred to non-functional overreach in one of your slides, and how challenging it can be for a coach to identify the signs of non-functional overreach as opposed to an athlete's just fatigued, and that's
yes, correct. Yeah, correct. That's a good observation, Jesse. And so there are a number of papers and quite a bit of research. Excuse me, quite a bit of research in this space about indicators. It can be in relation to sleep patterns. It can be in relation to mood. It can be in relation to decreased performance. So there's this recipe of things that you can look at. And so non-functional overreaching and overtraining syndrome and things like REDS or relative energy deficiency syndrome, I know some things about, but it's not completely in my wheelhouse. But what I will say is that it's worth looking up some of those papers, excuse me, on something like Google Scholar. And if you look up non-functional overreaching and systematic review or literature review, you'll get an idea of some papers that describe a bunch of other papers in terms of what does that look like? What are the factors that sort of describe a trend of an athlete heading towards non-functional overreaching, perhaps even worse, heading towards, heaven forbid, overtraining or even burnout at the other end of the spectrum.
Thanks, Layton. In lieu of any other questions, I've got one. It was about your slide was on communication. Alex, I'll read yours out after this. And it was about you mentioned that in the sample size that you had, that 85% of sessions were going without some kind of comment from the coach. Now, was that just looking at whether they commented in Training Peaks, or was that taking?
Yes, correct. Yes, correct. So we estimate that number, and I should have qualified that a bit more clearly. We estimate that those contact points, the number of communications, per day, per week, whatever the case may be, is indeed a lot higher using other communication technologies, instant messenger, text message, phone calls. But this is about contextualizing training for the athlete, providing them with some engagement in terms of, well, why am I uploading the data if it doesn't seem like you're commenting on it, if it doesn't seem like we're having an engagement at that level. Although that said, obviously, outside of the training management system, you may well be having conversations on the phone about, I had a look at Training Peaks today, or whatever training management system the athlete and the coach use. You did really well with that session. So comments may not appear in there. This is just based on our research.
Okay, we've got some more questions in the chat. Makeup of the athletes in the study, male, female?
The 95 one, yeah, I think, yeah. We, like a lot of studies, we try to encourage female participants. I think in the end it was something like 17 female athletes and the rest male athletes. So definitely skewed towards male athletes, not for lack of trying. Some of our research or recruitment posters were just showing female athletes and very much saying we need more female athletes to participate. Please sign up. We don't know why, although we do know also that in terms of participation in the sport that it is, I think I've got this right, still slightly skewed towards more male participation. So it's not necessarily a complete reflection of the existing profile of participation, but it's not worlds apart from it.
All right, we've got quite a few questions in here, which is very exciting. What type of, this is from Alex, what type of correlation do you use for programming strength training? and accounting for load management, given most of the objective metrics you capture is based on perceived rate of exertion, heart rate, etc. Do you
Yeah,
have any
that's an
on that?
absolutely fantastic question. It's a really interesting area of research that I taught. So a lot of the times with strength training, there's a whole bunch of different ways to measure strength training. Often that's done through reps, sets, weight, cumulative weight. Often it's reflected more in mechanical load than cardiovascular load and RPE as such. Those things tend to be more associated with um, um, cardiovascular oriented workout, running, cycling, swimming, and so forth. Um, Although team sports as well, but we're getting off track a bit. With strength training, there's probably two components that I would point you towards in terms of spacing between workouts, because the metabolic pathways at strength training and aerobic cardiovascular training, we need some separation because they use slightly different pathways. So that's a low prescription component. They're not necessarily an easy fit in terms of quantifying load. It's good to, and that's why it's good to get a sense of that post um, workout discussion with an athlete in terms of how they're coping with the strength training component within the context of their larger program. So if they've got a busy week with swim, bike, run, what sort of capacity do you have for two 30-minute or two 40-minute training sessions, strength training sessions? And bearing in mind, of the makeup of that workout also influences things. So if you're giving them a lot of heavy sets of deadlifts and squats and whatever the case is that those things then carry potentially, depending on the load, the mechanical weight, then carry potentially some muscle damage along with that. That's where those creatine kinase levels are elevated. And then if you prescribe a large brick session the next day, that's where you end up in trouble. So there are things to keep in mind. It's not a great answer. Combining mechanical strength or resistance training load with swim, bike, run load is challenging.
Thank you for that, Leighton. Next one is from Mick, and this is about face-to-face versus online training. And so, can you sort of talk to the athletes in the study? Was it sort of all online or virtual or remote, or have you got data on whether the coaches were face-to-face for these athletes or not, and what sort of the whether the coaches were able to make any kind of decisions and relationships based on sort of face-to-face and coaches are?
Yes, yeah, great question. So the answer is yes, that the coaches were coaching face to face. I think all of them were or maybe one wasn't coaching face to face. But one of the things that came out in terms of face to face contact was the unspoken component. How does the athlete look when they turn up to training? Are they kind of shoulders slumped and I can't be bothered being here today, or are they enthusiastic about training? So body language is a component of that. We were largely focusing on gathering data online, so as a consequence, the study was kind of skewed towards probably people that coach more online, but certainly we did get comments back from coaches about, well, what other indicators of how an athlete's coping with load do you look at? And body language and face-to-face communication was a component of that.
Thanks, Lloyd. Next question is from Jen. Can you speak to any research indicating differences between experienced and newer athletes being able to identify RPE more closely to objective data? My Spidey sense says newer athletes tend to report RPE lower than heart rate data indicates, and therefore tend to want to do more higher zone than is desired. Is there any data? Please.
There is some research on it. I don't want to speak too far out of school. I think there's some research papers by some people, Tirabini and Rapp. I think I've got that right. I'm not sure where exactly they're based, but they talk about very experienced athletes having exactly to that point, having a much better sense of how their perceived exertion, their internal feeling of how they're going, connecting at a much more reliable level than newer athletes, and so what's the consequence of that? They're less reliant on devices. They don't automatically accept what the device is saying because they're in tune with, well, I don't really agree with what the device is saying. I actually think for this rep, I've actually got a bit more in me. Rather than deferring to, well, I'm hitting this power number, I better stop there. That they trust their internal RPE more than newer athletes. Does that kind of answer the question, I think, maybe?
And chime in if you've got a follow-up. Alex Gosman's chimed in. Does the time of day make any difference for potential intensity of the session in any of the triangulated qualitative, quantitative measures?
That's a good question. We didn't ask about time of day impacting sessions. I think there is some research around that. One of the things that seems to be, and again, I'm speaking out of school here because this is not my area of research, but you can look up research in relation to sleep and circadian rhythms. And I think there's some papers around how, and I think we hear the terms night owl or are you a lark or are you a, what is it, early bird, different sayings around that, is that people do, as it turns out, it seems to be from at least one paper I've read, that people have unique circadian rhythms to some extent, and that also could be influenced indeed by their job or perhaps family as well if they've got young kids that get up early. And so some athletes might be better off doing training in the morning. Other athletes might be better off doing training in the middle of the day or in the evening, depending on life circumstance as well as circadian rhythms and other factors. Not my area really, so that's just a broad answer. I would encourage you to go and specifically search academic research, evidence-based literature using something like Google Scholars to get a better answer than what I've provided.
Thank you. There was one other slide that was sort of early on in your presentation that was talking about some of the observed or some of the observations, and one of them you spoke about was about coach bias, which I'm keen to unpack here if you give me some rope. Was one of the areas sort of around coaches will sometimes tend to coach the way they were trained as an athlete, i.e. I always do an interval run on a Tuesday. Was that something that you were sort of seeing there? And so I'm going to then bring that into my coaching expertise. Is that what you're referring to?
We didn't necessarily get into the detail of session structure, although I think some coaches talked a little bit about that. It was more around sort of metric preferences, technology preferences, and so you would have coaches that really seem to love the objective data, were very much about things like pace and power and duration and distance. Not to say that they disregarded or didn't care about subjective data, but they tended to prioritize objective data. And so we know from the existing literature, a very big body of literature around different data types, subjective and objective data, the recommendation is largely to have a balanced approach to data across both of those spheres because they help correlate a broader picture. And so that's the risk of having a bias towards, say, power versus another coach who said that they always come back to RPE and heart rate regardless of anything else. Is, again, that's fine to some extent, but RPE is subjective internal data and heart rate is internal objective data. And so you're kind of missing that external work has an internal cost. You're missing, well, what does the external work say about that internal cost? And you need to be able to tell the complete story.
It's certainly an interesting challenge for coaches. I mean, I'm sure everyone on the call has seen, for example, just to use Training Peaks as an example, if you would see an athlete's, let's say, a ride, their power data is going up, but yet, their comments, they're giving the frown face emoji every single session, and there's cooked written in the comments. And so how do you sort of reconcile those two pieces of what are basically contradictory data?
Yeah, I think the coach, and this is where any research, including our research, even though we've been doing the training load and triathlon coaching research for quite a period of time now, and I'm conducting my third and final PhD study at the moment, which is an intervention study, an education-based study around a lot of the things that I've talked about. But even then, you get to the end of that narrative, that story, and realize that, okay, we've had an understanding of how coaches kind of operate, potentially some of the gaps that need to be filled in terms of education. Now that we're going through this third study of trying to get them to fill those gaps, ... the next piece of research, which potentially is someone else's PhD or a postdoc or another university's research around the world, is okay. Now that we think we've optimized those things, how does that then influence performance? How does that influence short-term and longer-term health outcomes? So it may be that it ends up that they potentially don't get injured and sick as much. That means that over a longer period of time, they can progress more. This is of course what we hope. And hopefully more than that, they end up staying in the sport longer because they don't feel quite so stressed. They feel there's better alignment with their training to their broader life picture.
Right, we've got two more questions. Alex has asked a question about your yet to be published sneaky peeky data.
Yeah, sure.
So asterisk, guys, this isn't published yet. With your training load percentile table, is the capturing of age group athletes from sprint distance to full Ironman? And if so, are you able to break down based on actual preferred race distance, noting an Ironman athlete will build for generally longer than 6 months, therefore have a larger load, not comparable to an Olympic distance?
Yeah, fantastic question. I can give you some of the answer. The papers, I want to stress, not published yet. We looked at race distance preference. We looked at age group. We looked at the sex of the athlete. And I feel like I'm missing one. Race distance preference, sex of the athlete, age. Oh, and training phase. We looked at training phase as well. What I will tell you is that with two of those, there were not statistically significant differences, and it was a surprising result. With two other ones, there were statistically significant differences. So I won't talk about the findings because it's not published. It's not peer-reviewed research yet. It has to go through a process of having other academics from around the world pressure test the methodology and make sure that it stacks up. But we're fairly confident to the extent that we've submitted to a top-end journal, and we hope to have that come back. As I said, there will also be a web app where you can plug in training phase, race distance preference, sex, and age, and see how your data compares to, or your athlete's data compares to this particular cohort, which we think is kind of representative of age group triathletes around the world.
Okay, I've got another question. Even though the data skew between male and female, did you note any differences in the disaggregated data per gender and age group? And also wondering how subjective data is communicated depending on age groups and how to customize for that.
Great questions. Yes, we did. So other tables and other discussions in this paper address age groups specifically and address sex specifically. Again, I'm kind of giving you a sneak peek of the data. I won't talk about the specific findings because they need to go through a process before it's published. But what I will do is make sure that Jesse and AusTri are notified when it's published, and you'll likely see it pushed out through their channels and my own channels as well too. So yes, they were disaggregated, and you will see information broken down with race distance preference, with training phase, with the sex of the athlete, and with the age group, and discussion around what is significant and what is not statistically significant.
Thanks, Leighton. We got any more questions? People can unmute if they would like and ask a voice question.
Yes, Jesse, it's Alex. Can I have another go?
We can hear you, Alex. Absolutely.
Hi, Alex.
Yeah, and it's probably easier to ask than write. What about if an athlete and a coach are using events as a means to an end? So you might be, say, doing the Ironman, and
Sure.
you'll do a number of triathlons, or you might do a specialist, an ocean swim, a cycle race as part of it. But so you're doing them at a particular level of intensity. How does that sort of play off with a planned training load, if I can put it that way?
I'm wondering if I can interpret your question this way. So you're saying that an athlete potentially wants to include some events that are non-triathlon based, or
no,
could be
or triathlon, or the components of triathlon.
Yeah, sure. And so, I mean, I'm going to sort of go off being an academic, a sports scientist a bit, and sort of speak more from my coaching experience with the sports science component in the background, factoring in load. I think what you'll find is a coach will consider what sort of total stimulus that has in terms of your training. So let's take, for example, the ocean swim that you're talking about. I'm only going to name one because it's famous in my part of the world, the Pitter Pub, which I think is 1.2 kilometres or something like that, which can be quite rough at times. If someone's doing that, then they'll factor that into the training program as part of the intensity of that week or that block of training.
Okay. Thanks, Leighton.
Yep.
There we go. This is from Jonathan. I've observed that there is significant and noticeable difference bias between genders in reporting RPE. Did that come through in your research?
That's a good question. I don't know that we did have a look at RPE. We really looked at, because we were looking specifically at objective data. And the other thing why we didn't interrogate RPE to the same extent and it didn't end up publishing it is because what we saw in the data is that not all of those, in fact, not a big percentage, I can't remember what percentage, but not a massive percentage of those athletes use that RPE field or use that mood field. And so you get a lot of missing data, and it makes it difficult to extrapolate meaningful and useful statistics or reliable statistics. So you end up trying to justify why you're trying to publish something that's potentially not that reliable. I'm not sure if that's a great answer, but we didn't end up interrogating it in the end. So in this paper we're really looking at duration, distance, and I guess the true load measurement, which captures some intensity as well too, is TSS, or training stress score, which I want to stress is actually based on Bannister's TRIMP. So that TRIMP, Bannister's TRIMP's been around for a long time, and there are versions of that. TSS is based on Bannister's TRIMP, so it's based on a load metric that's been around for a long time.
Okay, I think we've got time for one final question, if anyone's got one. Chime on in. No? All right. Okay. Well, Leighton, thank you for your time tonight. Thank you also to Deakin University for their a really good chunk of research into the Australian triathlon community, coaching and training. We really appreciate that. We would love to have you back when your third study is complete. We would love to be able to welcome you back as Dr. Wells, and so we will invite you back later in the year.
Thank you very much. I look forward to both of those things. One, to coming back, also to handing in my thesis and getting my doctorate at some point later this year.
Thank you, coaches. Thank you, everyone, for turning up. You guys are the backbone of our sport, standing on pool deck probably at 5 a.m. So keep doing what you're doing. You guys are amazing, and have a wonderful rest of your evening wherever you are in Australia.
Thanks very much, Jesse, and Oz Try.